So we are here today with Jean Reese, who graduated from SAIS in the class of 1954. And I'm going to sit over here so you can look at the camera a little bit more. I'm Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Alumni Relations Officer from SAIS. And today's date is April 25th, 2012, and we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation. So thanks so much for being with us today. And why don't you first start and just tell us a little bit about what first brought you to SAIS?
Well, actually, it's a very simple answer. George McGee, who is a Dallasite and a very successful oil man who served in probably a couple of administrations, and I don't know exactly what connections he had with SAIS, but he offered a fellowship that was only available to people from Dallas County.
Oh, wow.
And I applied for it at one time before I was in the military and went to Korea. And when I came back, I was encouraged to apply again. And so I got this. I'd never heard of SAIS before. And so it was an interesting experience for me, I'll put it that way.
Okay.
But that's basically how I got to SAIS.
Okay. Well, terrific. Well, tell us a little bit about what your memories are while you were at SAIS.
Well, despite my fading memory, there seem to be a lot of memories still of SAIS. Well, I remember the first thing that I was a bit intimidated, overwhelmed, what have you. There was this guy from Dallas who had graduated from Southern Methodist University coming up to Washington, and here Dartmouth, Harvard, Stanford, Hamilton. I thought, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place, absolutely. But at the time, of course, the SAIS was at 1906 Florida Avenue, and the student body was around 50, might have been a bit more, and what have you. And it really was like a family, and rather paternalistic. And I think that people that attended at that time either liked it very much or they hated it. I happen to have liked it because SAIS actually was very good to me. I had some peculiar memories that I have. Of course, coming from SMU, Methodist University, and what have you, alcohol, etc. But I was in Bill Phillips' International Economic Seminar. And Bill and Dorothy Phillips later became sort of my surrogate father and mother. But, there's about 10 people maybe. And Jody Lewinson, who is also class of 54. She was quite a party giver, party planner, doing funny things.
I'm actually interviewing with her next week.
That's right. And so in Bill's class, it was around the time of the Kentucky Derby, and she always somehow co-opted me in these ventures, and said, why don't we make mint juleps and serve them to the class? I was aghast. What? Alcohol? So, dutifully made great mint juleps, and much to Bill's surprise and everybody else trundled in with this tray of mint juleps. And I just said, my gosh, this is something very different than I was accustomed to. On the other side, I was saying that SAIS was paternalistic pretty much, but they were also rather flexible because my area of specialization was Asia. I had served in Korea, and so I was very interested in etc. And of course, your language ought to be really Chinese or Japanese or some other. Well, I wasn't going to handle that. I had taken Spanish in college, and so I persevered with Spanish. The Spanish class, the professor was Senor Crespo. He's a great guy. And somehow I managed to wiggle some way and have Spanish as my language, which, well, I guess is sort of against the rules, but the school was very forgiving. But the most
They speak
scary
a lot of
time-
Spanish in Asia.
I'm sorry.
They speak a lot of Spanish in Asia.
Well, I was saying, well, in the Philippines, they used to speak Spanish. I think one of the scariest times at school was having to pass the bloody oral language exam.
Right.
And so when that time came, I walked into the examining room, Crespo and two others. Senora, you stand up. And hand me a clipping from New York Times by Walter Lippmann, who at that time was quite a well-known political commentator, what have you. And he said, now, would you give us a précis in Spanish? Somehow I got through that examination, and how exactly, to this day, I don't really know. But the students, when I was there, we had a great bunch, and we formed a student committee that sort of by default I ended up being chairman, and we used to meet with Phil Thayer, the dean, weekly, and we took little projects under our wing. We decided to, there was a basement in 1906 Florida, and we made that into sort of a rec room. And somebody donated a ping pong table. Bill Phillips donated a television set. They couldn't have been the screen more than 9 inches by 9 inches. It was the smallest. And we sat around and watched the McCarthy Army hearings on that television set. And we also would organize, well, let me back up. President's sales in Washington at that time were on February 22nd. And there were real sales that didn't extend throughout the year. And we organized a team that would go down and stand in line all night and be there at the opening. We put our fastest person to run in. I think we were shooting for a refrigerator for our rec room.
I think they're still doing that today.
Yeah, really? That's great. Another thing that I remember so well, Jody and I were sort of, we had organized people to come in and give us talks at luncheons. You know, we organized, the students did this. And we had, of course, two diverse groups in the student body. Here was the liberals, and of course we had the conservatives. And Jody and I and Ruth Sorensen, it was at that time, and later Singer, people like that. And Dean Etchison, of course, was one of our icons. And so we said, let's get Dean Etchison to come and speak to us. And he was in law practice at that time. And of course, Dean Etchison sort of belonged to one of the 3 or maybe even 4 martinis for lunch crowd. So Jody and I were deputed to go pick him up downtown and bring him to the lunch. We had lunch. And by the time he got up to speak, you know, he was really, really drunk actually. And he somehow got through the speech, but you know, it was like discovering your idol has clay feet. And so, but we remember that so much. And of course, the 1906 Florida Avenue facility used to be Gunston Hall, a girls' school. And I know this has been mentioned by other people, but I remember so well the library on the 2nd floor, which is where the gymnasium had been. And the markings on the floor were still there for, you know, basketball, what have you. And the librarian at that time was Frank Shark, who was a real character, who also became a good friend. He's still living, lives in Paris, and he must be 90 by now. But to go in there and take books out there, it was really quite experiencing. I don't want to overburden burden us with too many of these things, but everybody who was at SAIS at that time, of course, remembers Kerrigan's very well. I have one memory. I almost hesitate to give it. I won't use the name, but my roommate was a very studious, well-organized, devoted person, and I couldn't say the same about myself. But he, about 6 o'clock, he would get in his pajamas, and he usually had a bag of apples or something in the room, and he would start studying. And in the course of his studying, and I was up trying to sort of study too, he would start cracking his knuckles, and he'd go through all the knuckles on his hands. And then he started on his feet. By that time, I was out of there, and I was at Kerrigan's ordering a pitcher of beer. This is a guy who had his whole career planned out. I didn't know what I was going to do the next day, but that vision stays with me even to these days. We became, well, food was a bit of a problem. At one point, we actually had a very small serving on the first floor of the school. They could make sandwiches and stuff, but that didn't last. So we became experts in all the cheap places to eat up and down Connecticut Avenue. Empire Drug was one. The Old Stein was another. And we, knew Shoals Cafeteria, of course, was a popular one. And we really splurged on the weekends. Sometimes we would go to Iron Gate Inn, which is still in business, but a very different place, I think. And there was a German restaurant, which is gone now, Old Europe. And then the only northern Chinese place I could find, that we could find, was Peking, which was out at Chevy Chase Circle. So we would go out there. So these were big, big events for us. Without going into details, the parties we planned, and the Christmas party particularly, they were really great. And there were so many clever people in those classes that I was with. I was just blown away. I would just close by mentioning one incident connected with the Christmas party. Two of my schoolmates were from New York City. One was Philip Arnold, who unfortunately died a number of years ago, and Irv Rubinstein. And we became good friends, and they were really streetwise, and they were always sort of educating me, in New York style. So when it came to be Christmas, we needed a Christmas tree. I had a car with me up there. They didn't, and they said, "Okay, let's go out and get a Christmas tree and bring it." Oh, okay. So we tried and said, "Okay, let's go out." So we drove out Leesburg Pike out into the Virginia countryside, and they said, "Stop! Oh, there's a good-looking tree over there." So we stopped the car, went over into somebody's estate, and cut down this tree quite illegal. I thought we're going to be pounced upon in any minute with somebody with a shotgun, and lashed it to the top of the car and brought it back to SAIS. It was about 8 feet tall. It was a beautiful tree, and it was all illegal. Anyway, with that, I guess I ought to stop. There's so many.
We have this on tape now. No, I'm just joking.
Well, I meant what these things.
I'm just kidding.
Now, Burma, that's probably going to be too much to talk about.
Was the Rangoon Center during your stay at SAIS, or is this something that
Well,
happened? Because I can ask
whenever, Phil Thayer went out and he had some connections. One was with I think they called the rector, which is a British term, of the university, who was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Tenong. So they hatched the idea of establishing a Rangoon Hopkins Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So Bill Phillips, Joe Fisher, David Fanner, who now lives in Australia, and I, and Wingate Lloyd came out subsequently, were assigned the task of being the first fellows and to establish the center. So this is June of 1956. Go out, and Bill hadn't arrived. I was the first one, I think, to arrive in Rangoon. And I'm thinking, what am I doing here? And after a week in staying in the hotel, the famous Strand Hotel, there was a building being constructed at the university at that time, which was, the proper name was Junior Lecturers Bachelor's Quarters, but better known by a British term called chummery. So I was put into the chummery. It still was being built around me, so to speak. This housed mainly Indian professors, teachers who came on contract to teach, and some others. And we had a sort of international grouping too, from time to time. And so the room I was given is, the concrete thing, and there was cement floor, and there was a bed. It's a very simple bedstead with mosquito netting, and there was a little desk like that with a chair, and I think there was some kind of a plastic-like lamp on it. That was it. And so I had to go and had to buy what in British India is called almirah. It's a closet, and had to go downtown, buy that, have it put in, and then we also had to organize eating groups. David Fanner and I lived in the chummery. He came subsequently, and Joe Fisher, who had gotten married, lived in some other quarters, and so there were really 4 different kitchens outside that only had sort of a charcoal thing. And we had to hire a cook and get a cook and organize it. Ours was sort of the international group. Anyone odd belonged to, we had some Indians and Sinhalese, and from time to time we had a Yugoslav student who was there, et cetera, et cetera. And we had to do the marketing. We rotated the management on a monthly basis. And our cook, who was South Indian, he only could cook using 2 tons of chili pepper, which was great. But I won't go into any more detail on that. But the experience in Burma was really incredible because we were able to move around. David Fanner and I, for example, took a 6-week-long trip going all around through the Shan states, Kachin State, up along the China border. We traveled by 3rd-class rail, went to Mandalay, hired a jeep. We traveled by jeep. We traveled by ox cart. We spent a week on the Irrawaddy River, a river steamer, coming back down. And we were able to visit areas that even to this day, I think very few foreigners are allowed to go because the border with China hadn't even been fully demarcated at the time. And we went to the Lashio and Michina, everywhere. We even went to one place. We told our driver we want to visit an opium den. So we went, I think it's Lashio, and we went downstairs in this place, and David and I were all ready to try this out. And there was one guy down there who was lying on the bed, with a pipe and smoking opium, and they showed us how to do it. And it's really yucky. You take the opium and you sort of melt it partly over a flame. You have these little lamps, and it becomes looks like tar. And we were quite prepared to do this, but it was so awful, the surrounding, that we gave up. So we never got to sample our opium. We gave up on it. We studied Burmese. I studied Burmese very intently. I had 2 tutors. Well, one teacher who was furnished by the university, and then I had a separate tutor named Daw Hannah, who was a Korean, one of the ethnic groups of Christian. And every morning I went to her, and then we had these other guys. I got to where I was reasonably fluent. I could even read and write some. And
very good.
our teacher from the university was a delightful little petite young woman who was one of the best Burmese dancers. Her name was Dor Yin Yin Chin. And I even was given a Burmese name.
Which
Tin Maung Mien. Which when I would give it to my Burmese, says that's a movie star kind of name. But, and you had to get your name to be done properly. It had to coincide with the day of the week you were born on. And I was born on Saturday, which they call it Saturn, Sanene. And my name reflected that. We did have a big, I'll give one more memory, or two, maybe two. But one of the things that we did at the center, we managed to get something, rooms, and start a library and what have you. But we did organize a Southeast Asian conference. And we drew scholars from all over, from Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, etc. It's quite a big affair. And it was published, there's a book that was published, the proceedings by Johns Hopkins. But the president of Burma threw a dinner party to celebrate this group. And you had to wear a formal dress. Well, most of those guys, some of those guys came, and they didn't pack a tux or anything. Now, David and I, we had the tux because they were really a party town in Rangoon, plenty of parties. And so we said, okay, we'll loan our tuxes out. But what are we going to wear? Well, I had this wonderful, it's a very beautiful Burmese outfit. The longi is this skirt it was beautiful silk, and you have a white shirt, and then a jacket, a black jacket, and then even this turban that there's a picture of the group with Phil Thayer wearing what's called a gamba. So David and I dressed in this formal Burmese style, and when we got there, we found that probably only about the only other people wearing Burmese costume, I think, was the president and the waiters. And so we sort of stood out. But the most embarrassing incident happened when we pulled up under the what you call it, a crochet, and these longies you tie with a knot, but it's a rather loose thing and very slippery with the silk. And as I alighted from the car, my lunge was, I had to grab it quickly and pull it up. We were quite well known in Rangoon because we only had, our only transportation were bicycles. Mm-hmm. Bill Phillips had a Jeep assigned to him. Mm-hmm. And David Fenner and I, when we would go to parties frequently, we went on our bicycle. And here we are bicycling along in our tux. So everybody, we had friends from the president's son on down to the sweepers and the mail clerks and what have you. Yeah.
So would it be okay to move on to the next question? Just in terms of your career after SAIS? Or did you want to talk about it?
Right.
Just tell us a little bit when you graduated after all of these great experiences.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit
about
what
happened
your
when I came back from Rangoon.
Yeah.
I was hanging around the school, and I didn't really want to go to work. But anyway, the school, Priscilla Mason called me up and said, listen, because they're always looking after their grads. Mm-hmm. I knew I was unemployed. And she said, there's someone from Ford Motor Company coming. And so arranged an interview for you. Well, I always thought, I'd work for the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller, but motor car company, no. But I said, I better go and at least give the appearance that I really want to get a job.
Yeah.
So I went. It was the international division. And the gentleman that interviewed me was named Filmer Paradise. And it was such an interesting thing. It sounded very good. And so somehow they decided they would fly me out to Dearborn and have interviews out there. And then in this was April of 1958, I guess, probably. Anyway, and so I packed up my belongings and drove up to German to start work for Ford International. And it was a very good job. It's a small forward planning unit.
And that was, I'm sorry, where was that?
In Dearborn. We were in the central office building.
Okay.
I did, after a month in Dearborn, which I couldn't take any more of, I moved to Ann Arbor where there were other colleagues, and it was a great place. I loved it. I met my wife there, she was at the University of Michigan. And so I worked for Ford, did some really interesting things. And, and one of the things was that the European Union was just coming into being as a market. We did great studies of that, etc. But my friends back here, Bill and others, were saying, hey, the aid program to Burma, U.S. aid program, which had been suspended at the request of the Burmese, is going to be restarted. You got to come. And I thought, I've been there and knew the language, and I was so tempted. So after a great deal of thought, I resigned from Ford. And I came to Washington. I was married at that time, and my wife was expecting our first child. So we came to Washington. And of course, that was ICA at that time that became USA. The reopening of the Burma program was delayed. So they put me on the Pakistan desk to place me somewhere. And so there I was, on Pakistan, not that I wanted to be. And you had to wait for my daughter to be born in the 3 months. And then went out to Pakistan to be the program officer for what was West Pakistan, because we had East Pakistan at the time, which is now Bangladesh. And so I was with AID in Pakistan from the end of 1959 until 1964, when the U.S. government very generously sent me to Harvard for sort of what is now the Kennedy School, paid for everything, tuition, family, etc., etc. And so I was there getting the, sort of a mid-career degree. And Harvard had a program, which they still have, of putting advisors out in various developing countries. And so one of the first groups was in Pakistan. So they asked me if I would take leave of absence and go back to Pakistan and join the Harvard group. Well, I knew the Harvard group from being there and everything. And I said, yeah, good for a career. And the mission director said, yeah, it's in U.S. interest, blah, blah, blah. But AID, being the most bureaucratic organization I have ever encountered, insisted that they had me programmed to go to Nepal as the program, which would be fun. But I got so annoyed, and I went through hoops trying to get this silly leave of absence, which had been given to other people, that I finally wrote a letter which asked for this leave, but saying it's in the interest of the U.S., it's in my own personal interest. If it's not given, I resign. I resigned, went out, so I was back in Pakistan as an economic advisor to the government from 1965 until November 1967. And I finished in 1967, having weathered the first, I was in Lahore, Pakistan, which is a very good place to be. The first war with India in 1965. And then I came back and I joined the World Bank. And so I came to Washington with the World Bank at the end of 1967. And I remained working with the bank until I retired in 1988.
So 21 years. Yeah.
My 20 years. In that time, I spent 4 years in Bangkok as the bank's representative to the Mekong Basin Committee, which is a development thing, plus doing other things, dealing with Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam. And so I retired in 1980. After I retired, typically I did consulting for the bank, for the UNDP a little bit, for USAID, etc. And some other colleagues from the bank had also retired. We formed two companies. One was a training institute. Privatization was becoming a big thing then, and we offered courses to teams coming from all over the world, 2 weeks courses, something like that. And also a consulting group to complement that, we thought. The Training Institute was not for profit, non-profit thing. The consulting thing was for profit. Well, the training thing made a profit. The consulting thing never made a profit. But, and then, after doing this a while, I did it for 10 years maybe. I decided I want to do some other things. So we dissolved the companies, and since, over the last few years, I have been involved in writing a book, a history book, which I'm sorry I ever got involved with, but I can't get out now, about a country that really, other than people that attend SAIS, probably don't know much about, and that's Liberia. I had some responsibilities in the bank for several African countries, including Liberia. And I am currently trying to finish the last 2 chapters. But it's like, I think, the proverbial PhD thesis where, the candidate gets almost to the end, but he can't quite finish. It goes on for years. So anyway, it's
terrific.
Been,
so that's
and SAIS, without SAIS certainly, obviously turned my life, I guess turned my life around. Originally I had planned to go to law school and maybe get into politics in Texas and blah, 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 and marry some nice Texas girl. Instead I married a Chinese lady, and, everything else.
That's great. I talk to a lot of people, and they often say, they went in with a whole outline of what they thought their life was going to be, and they go to SAIS and they end up doing 20 other things, There's never one path with a SAIS graduate, and you just have to kind of be open.
Right.
But
SAIS is such a rich experience, and I've always been grateful to George McGee and the school too.
Yeah, and thinking about current students today, actually, what advice might you have for them, given your illustrious career?
I'm afraid the advice that I'd give is pretty much the shop-worn, standard kind of stuff. But I do know, and if you look at the graduates from SAIS, you don't have to feel that you are going to be wedded to one thing. I mean, there are so many opportunities that it seems to me become available to you with your SAIS background, that you can afford to change your career direction, particularly early on in the career. And you shouldn't hesitate to do that, in my view. Polonius' advice to Hamlet, above all, be true to thine own self. I think it's really difficult to give very much. Everybody sort of has to find his own path almost. But the point I would make is that do find your own path. find something that you really want to do, and also realize that you're not hobbled. You can move around much more freely than certainly than I thought. I know today it's a little bit different, and it's probably not quite so easy.
Well, terrific. Well, we really appreciate your time. And thanks so much for all you do for the world and for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, actually.